The single sheet of paper in his hand felt heavier than a bar of gold. For Adrian Sterling, a man who measured his life in market shares and acquisitions, this was the one asset he never wanted. It was a ghost from a past he'd buried under concrete, steel, and a mountain of ruthless ambition. He stared out from his penthouse office, looking down on the glittering carpet of city lights he believed he owned. But none of it mattered now. Some 24-year-old kid, a total stranger, was claiming to be his son. And Adrian knew, with the kind of certainty that had defined his entire life, that it was impossible. He was sterile. A diagnosis from decades ago was the silent, sterile foundation he'd built his entire empire on. This wasn't just a lie, it was an attack on his reality. Adrian Sterling wasn't just a millionaire, he was the architect of his own universe. His world was all clean lines, predictable outcomes, and absolute control. From his minimalist office to his hand-picked board of directors, every piece of his life was designed to eliminate messy variables. Emotion was a liability. Attachments were a weakness. His marriage was a strategic alliance, and his 2 children, raised by nannies and tutors, were heirs to a legacy, not members of a family. The news didn't arrive in a dramatic confrontation, but in a cold email from his lawyer. The subject line was simple: urgent private matter. Attached was a letter from a law firm representing a Mr. Ethan Vance. The letter was polite, professional, and it was a grenade. It detailed a relationship Adrian had almost forgotten, a summer romance over 2 decades ago with a woman named Elena. It ended by saying that her son, Ethan, was the product of that romance and wanted to make contact. Adrian's first reaction wasn't anger. It was a cold, dismissive laugh. He picked up the phone, his voice a low growl. "Thompson," he said to his lawyer, "this is a joke, a shakedown. Find out what they want, give them a nuisance fee, and make them go away." "I've already looked into it, Adrian," his lawyer replied, his voice cautious. "The young man isn't after money. He says his mother, Elena, passed away a few months ago. She left him a box of letters and a journal. He says she just wanted him to know who his father was." The name Elena was a crack in the polished marble of his composure. He hadn't let himself think that name in 25 years. Elena, with her wild hair and a laugh that could fill a room. She was a variable he couldn't control. A brief, chaotic, beautiful summer before he inherited his father's firm and the weight of expectation that came with it. "It's impossible," Adrian snapped, his words clipped and sharp. "I have medical records. I was diagnosed as sterile at 22. It's a non-starter." This medical fact was a cornerstone of his identity. It had absolved him of certain guilts, of certain possibilities. It was why he'd accepted his father's arranged marriage without a fight. It was a truth he'd built his life on. "He's willing to take a DNA test," Thompson said quietly. "He says he just wants the truth." Adrian let out a short, harsh laugh. "The truth? Fine. He'll get the truth. Set it up. I want this farce over, and I want it over quickly. I will personally deliver the negative result to this boy, and then you will bury him and his lawyers in so much litigation they'll wish they were never born." For Adrian, the DNA test wasn't about discovery. It was a weapon. It was the final, definitive rejection that would silence this ghost from his past. Once and for all, he was certain of the outcome. But for the first time in a very, very long time, a tiny, unsettling echo of a forgotten memory began to stir in the cold, quiet vault of his heart. The meeting was on Adrian's terms, his office, his territory. He wanted the young man to be intimidated, to feel the weight of the world he was trying to break into. But Ethan Vance wasn't what he'd expected. He wasn't some slick, opportunistic grifter. He was a quiet kid with his mother's eyes and a nervous energy he tried to hide behind a steady gaze. He wore a simple jacket that looked like it was bought just for this meeting. He looked, Adrian had to admit with a flash of irritation, like a decent kid. "Mr. Sterling," Ethan began, his voice surprisingly soft. "Thank you for seeing me." Adrian didn't offer him a seat. He stayed behind his massive desk, a king in his castle. "Let's skip the pleasantries. You've made an extraordinary claim, based on what the ramblings in a dead woman's diary." Ethan flinched but held his ground. "My mother loved you," he said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "She wrote about you my whole life. She never told me your name, just that you were the love of her life, and that circumstances kept you apart. After she died, I found her journals, your letters. She wanted me to know." "What she wanted," Adrian shot back, his voice dripping with condescension, "was to fill your head with fairy tales. What we had was brief. A summer fling. It ended. We moved on." "She didn't," Ethan said quietly. "She wrote that your family forced you apart, that they told her you wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. She moved away to have me, to save you from a scandal." A memory pricked at Adrian. The fight with his father, the threats, the pressure. He'd been told Elena had taken money and just disappeared. He'd been young, ambitious, and all too willing to believe the convenient lie that let him step into the future his father had planned. "It's all very touching," Adrian said, shoving the memory away. "But it's irrelevant. There's a simple biological fact that makes your whole story a fantasy. I can't have children. I was diagnosed as sterile years before I even met your mother." Ethan's face fell, his eyes clouded with confusion. That can't be true." "Oh, it is," Adrian said, savoring the look of defeat on the young man's face. This was the checkmate. "But because I'm a generous man and because I want this nonsense put to rest with scientific finality, I've agreed to your little test. My doctor will take the sample right here, right now. When the results prove what I already know, you will sign a document renouncing this claim forever, and you will disappear. Are we clear?" "Just sounds most over you." Ethan just nodded, looking pale and lost. His confidence was gone, crushed by Adrian's cold, hard facts. For Adrian, it was victory. The test was just a formality, the final nail in the coffin of a story that should have stayed buried. He watched the doctor take the samples, a sterile, clinical procedure that perfectly mirrored his own life. It was done. It was over. On the surface, the next week was business as usual. Adrian closed a multi-billion-dollar merger, fired an executive for a minor dip in profits, and smiled for the cameras at a charity gala with his wife. He projected total, unshakable confidence. The DNA test was just a loose end he'd already mentally tied up. But underneath, something was off. The name Elena had unlocked a room in his mind he had sealed shut for 25 years. In the quiet moments in the back of his limo, in the dead of night, the memories ambushed him. He remembered Elna not as a fling, but as the only person who had ever seen past the Sterling name. She was a painter who laughed at his expensive watch and dragged him to hole-in-the-wall diners. He remembered the smell of turpentine and cheap wine in her tiny apartment, a world away from the sanitized life he knew. He remembered lying under the stars, listening to her talk about her dreams, and feeling, for the first time, the terrifying, thrilling possibility of a different kind of life. And he remembered the end. His father, a man made of iron and expectation, had found out. He'd called Elena a gold-digging distraction, a threat to the empire. Adrian, just 23 and desperate for his father's approval, had put up a weak fight. His father had been merciless. "I will ruin her, Adrian. I will make sure she never works in this city again. I will crush her unless you end this now." A week later, his father showed him a private investigator's report. It showed Elena accepting a pile of cash. "She's gone," his father had said with a smirk. "Took the money and ran. I told you what she was." Adrian had believed him. It was easier to believe she was a gold digger than to believe he was a coward. The pain was sharp, but it was a clean wound. He let it cauterize his heart and used the scar tissue to build his empire. His sterility diagnosis from a year earlier had just been a convenient footnote proof that a family with Elena was never in the cards. It was the story he needed to live with himself. But now, he questioned it all. Ethan's words echoed in his head. She wrote about how your family forced you apart. Could his father have lied? Faked the report. Could the entire foundation of his cold, calculated life be built on a lie designed to control him? The questions were like a poison, seeping into the certainty that had always been his greatest armor. The call came on a crisp Friday afternoon. It was Thompson, his lawyer. The results are in, Adrian. I think you should come to the office to review them. There was a strange hesitation in his lawyer's voice. Adrian hated hesitation. Just read it to me, Thompson. Let's get this over with. Adrian, please come to the office. A cold dread, foreign and unwelcome, started to pool in Adrian's stomach. He got to the law firm in 20 minutes. Thompson, a man who'd navigated Adrian's brutal corporate takeovers without blinking, looked pale. He slid a single, sealed envelope across the desk. You wanted to deliver the news yourself, Thompson said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe you should be the first to see it. Adrian's hands felt clumsy as he tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the jargon, searching for the number, the final percentage. And then he saw it, staring back at him in stark black ink. Probability of paternity, 9.999%. The numbers didn't make sense. They swam before his eyes, mocking him. He read it again, and again. 9.99%. It had to be a mistake, a fraud. This is wrong, Adrian said, his voice tight. They made a mistake. Or this kid, Ethan, he paid someone off. Run it again. Use a different lab. Thompson slowly shook his head. Adrian, this is the most reputable lab in the country. We had a chain of custody on the samples the whole time. There was no tampering. I've already called to verify. The result is accurate. Adrian Sterling sank into a chair, the crisp report crinkling in his white-knuckled fist. The world tilted. The sterile diagnosis. His father's lies. Elena's disappearance. 25 years of cold, hard certainty dissolved in an instant. It wasn't just a number. It was a wrecking ball, and it had just obliterated the foundation of his life. He wasn't childless. He had a son. Elena hadn't betrayed him. She'd been sent away. His father had stolen his life. He had stolen his son. The air in the room grew thin. The city noise outside faded to a dull roar. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The ruthless millionaire, the man with an answer for everything, was utterly, devastatingly silent. The truth had arrived, not as a whisper, but as a deafening explosion. And the man known as Adrian Sterling was shattered in the blast. Back in the silence of his penthouse, Adrian stood at the window, but he didn't see the city. He saw a ghost. He saw Elena's face with an agonizing clarity. He saw her smile, heard her laugh, as if she were standing right behind him, whispering a truth he'd refused to hear for 25 years. The ruthless facade he'd so carefully built hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated. The man left standing in its place was a stranger to himself, hollowed out by a grief so huge it felt like a cavern in his chest. It was grief for a woman he had wronged, for a son he'd never known, and for the man he might have become if he hadn't been such a coward. The old medical report declaring him sterile, that was the lie that made all the others possible. He realized now his father must have faked that, too. A paid-off doctor, a falsified result. It was a brilliant, cruel masterstroke. By convincing Adrian he could never have his own biological heir, His father ensured he'd accept the arranged marriage and the path set for him. He'd made Adrian a willing prisoner in a gilded cage. First came the rage, a hot, blinding fury at his dead father. He wanted to scream, to smash the priceless art on his walls, to tear down the empire built on deceit. His entire legacy felt like a monument to a lie. Then, guilt washed over him. Elena hadn't run. She had been driven away, and she had been pregnant with his son. He pictured her alone and scared, having their child while he was closing deals and celebrating his own rise. The thought was a knife in his gut. He had let his father paint her as a villain, and in doing so, he had become one. He looked at a framed photo on his desk, his wife and their 2 children on a yacht. He'd always felt detached from them and chalked it up to his own cold nature. Now, he wondered if it was because, deep down, some part of him knew they weren't his. Was it all just another arrangement by his father to secure the dynasty? The DNA test hadn't just given him a son. It cast a terrifying doubt over the family he thought he had. He was Adrian Sterling, a name that commanded fear and respect. But in that moment, he was nothing. He was a man whose life story was a fiction written by someone else. The shock wasn't just that he had a son. The shock was realizing that he, the master of his universe, had never really existed at all. Adrian's life was built on a story that turned out to be a complete lie. What happens when one undeniable fact blows up everything you thought you knew? He was forced to see the difference between the life he was living and the life he was meant to have. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed how you saw yourself or your family? Share your story in the comments. It's often in these shocking moments that we find out who we really are. For 2 days, Adrian stayed in his penthouse. He canceled meetings, ignored his wife's calls, and shut out the world. The city lights that once looked like power now just seemed to mock him. He spent the hours replaying the past, seeing it all through the new brutal lens of the truth. The grief was a physical weight, but slowly, something else began to emerge from the wreckage responsibility. He had a son, a 24-year-old man named Ethan, who grew up without a father because of lies he'd been too weak to question. A young man who hadn't asked for money, but for the truth, a truth Adrian had tried to crush. The anger at his father was still there, a smoldering coal in his chest, but it was joined by a new, terrifying urge, the need for redemption. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't give Elena the life they should have had. He couldn't get back the 24 years he'd lost with his son, but he could change what happened next. His whole life had been about taking. He realized this had to be about giving. It had to be about atonement. But how he didn't know how to be a father. He barely knew how to be a person outside a boardroom. What could he even offer Ethan? Money felt like an insult, a cheap replacement for a lifetime of absence. On the 3rd morning, he stood at the window as the sun came up. It was a new day, and for the first time, it felt like it could be a new beginning. He picked up his phone, his hand steady for the first time in days. He scrolled past the titans of industry to the number his lawyer had sent him. Ethan Vance. He hit call before he could change his mind. It rang twice. "Hello," a hesitant voice answered. Adrian took a breath. This wasn't the voice of a grifter. It was the voice of his son. All the power drained from his own voice, leaving something softer, something he hadn't heard in decades. "Ethan," he said. It's Adrian Sterling." He paused, the name feeling strange in his own mouth. "I was wrong. We need to talk." A single DNA test did what no market crash or corporate rival ever could. It brought Adrian Sterling to his knees. But in the rubble of his old life, something new began to grow. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be filled with awkward conversations, painful truths, and the huge task of building a relationship from the ashes of a 25-year-old lie. The ruthless millionaire was gone, shattered by a truth he never saw coming. In his place was just a man, a father, taking the first terrifying step toward an unknown future, finally ready to learn about the son he never knew. and the man he was always supposed to be.